Hello, everyone, and a very warm welcome to our event on the subject of the mythical English reader. My name is Daniel Hahn, and I'm very pleased to have been asked to chair this conversation, which is part of the National Centre for Writing's International Translation Day celebration. This event is in partnership with BCLT, with the Centre for Literary Translation, an organisation some of you watching will know, which is celebrating its 30th anniversary this year. And today we're also celebrating the 10th anniversary of the Emerging Translator Mentorship Programme, which Somrita, one of our speakers today, has been a mentee on that programme, and Anton, one of our other speakers, is just about to start as a mentor on that programme. At the end of our conversation today, we're going to be announcing the selected emerging translators for the 10th anniversary programme. But first, we have what I'm sure is going to be a fascinating conversation with these four lovely people. We have Anton and Gitanjali and Wei Ting and Somrita, who are at this point scattered in various places in the world, various time zones, only one wardrobe apparently, but in every other respect, an interesting variety of people and places. Anton is in Korea. He's a translator from Korean. Gitanjali is a translator from Portuguese based in the UK. Wei Ting translates from Japanese, as well as being a writer herself, and is in Singapore. And Somrita is in India and translates from Bangla. There should be more extensive bios of them on the page, so I'm not going to go into that too much. We have a lot to cover, so I'm not going to say very much by way of introduction. Except that, very roughly speaking, the reason we have this topic, the mythical English reader, is because we're thinking about the problems that are created by the idea somehow that there isn't a uniformity of receivers of translated literature. So this English reader is not a particular person, but is kind of an embodiment of, poster child for, kind of mascot for this very limiting, very rigid structure that we're going to be talking about today. The mythical English reader, if we were going to have to define who they are, I suspect it would be somewhere between me and Gitanjali, I think, by which I mean someone close to one of the big publishing centres of the English-speaking world, somebody probably educated, somebody probably white, somebody probably female. The fact that that is a description of a very large proportion of people who are editors in publishing is no coincidence, I think. But I'm going to start with, I suppose, the most general question to ask Anton first, about who your reader is. Who are you translating for when you translate, Anton?
Well, that's a very easy question to answer because it's myself. I am the mythical English reader. It is moi, c'est moi. So I have an aesthetic opinion, and I've been speaking English and for a while now, and I read English. My English isn't too bad. So for me, and I'm the first reader for my translations, of course. So for me, it's always, I am the reader that I have to satisfy. But then when I became a professional literary translator, and I would, go to workshops, and there was this one workshop where the workshop leader took a translation of mine and said, "Oh, this is awkward." And I asked them, "Oh, okay, that's interesting. So what is awkward about, what does awkward mean?" And then they go, "It's, awkward." And I thought about that. I thought, what is that? So what does it mean if something is awkward? It means it's awkward to you. Obviously, I didn't think it was awkward because it's not awkward to me. I did the translation. But what made them feel entitled to make such a judgment? It's just awkward. Now, some things are just awkward. A lot of things are just, and you can tell if something is just awkward sometimes, a lot of times actually. But this, I feel, was really not that. I feel like if something is awkward, you should be able to articulate it. I don't know. So it was, and that was the first time I ever experienced something like that. And then after I did workshops, I would get edits and go into more prestigious workshops where I would meet more prestigious translators and people, and they would have all of these subtle little kind of almost microaggressions where they would be like, oh, an English reader would not read that. And it's not so much that they find it awkward that's the problem. It's that they would use this weird construct of this mythical English reader in order to justify their criticisms. And that's when I started to sort of interrogate that bias.
Is this a conversation which you have, Anton, with publishers before you do a translation? So would you have a conversation with an editor, you're signing a contract and say, this is what I think, this is who I'm translating for, I'm not really interested in that notion of the reader, but I have this sense. Is it a conversation you have or you feel you can have actually before you sit down and work?
I don't think it's a conversation that I can have with editors and publishers before I really feel like this is so politically wrought, and in the power differential, I am so in the inferior position that I can't really have that discussion with editors and with publishers, although they themselves may not consciously have that bias. And I haven't really encountered that with, interestingly enough, with publishers so much, but I've encountered that mostly with professors, in workshops, and with critics. And that's really interesting to me, that the actual editors and the actual publishers have been actually very, very kind of open to, oh, okay, so this is what you're doing. Why don't you try this? Why don't you try this? Like, they would never say something like, this is awkward, or this is, an English reader would find this awkward. Like, that's not the way they couch their criticism. So it's that sort of difference that I haven't really thought about until this moment. But yeah, that is definitely a kind of thing that exists. But I don't discuss it with editors, mostly because I don't need to. They seem to know how to get edits done. I mean, they deal with people who are even more diva-ish than I am all the time. So I imagine that they're very good at couching their criticisms.
Well, that is reassuring that the problem that you haven't encountered that problem kind of at the editorial point in publishing. But I'm curious, Somrita, I said in the introduction you're based in India, but you're not just kind of, as it were, circumstantially based in India. You're also working a lot with Indian publishers, and I wonder if your view of this is different. Whether there is a different sense of, I suppose, who that person is that Anton was referring to, or is there no sense from publishers or anyone else that there is a kind of figure who can be used as an excuse to decide what is acceptable and what isn't?
Danny, I think I want to go back to what you asked Anton just a couple of seconds ago, where you said you have that conversation with the editor. And possibly because I've worked with editors that I know or have known for a while, I have managed to have that conversation. So I tend to know who the book or the translation is for. Is it for an Indian readership? Is it primarily for somebody in the UK? Is it primarily for someone in the US? And I don't think my translation changes vastly, but there are subtle changes, and I'm aware of that. So for someone that is reading a book from India in the UK and is not aware of, let's say, how caste works in India, I will try to massage in more information while I'm translating to sort of, contextualize what I'm translating. So yes, I have had the chance to have that conversation with editors to figure out who my readers are. But who am I translating for? I think, unlike Anton, I don't translate for myself. I translate for people that do not have access to Bangla or Hindi, because I've read this somewhere, and they said good writing, good art is like the sun. It's meant for everybody, and through my translation, I try to carry some of the warmth of that sun to corners of the world where its rays don't reach. So yeah, I'm not translating for someone that has access to Bangla. Subconsciously, I think I'm always translating for someone that will not be able to read Bangla.
That's interesting. I mean, I wonder, Gitanjali, in that case, Anton's answer, who do you translate for, came very quickly. He knew exactly who it was. And it's something that Somrita has talked about, maybe having a conversation with the publisher about who that reader is. And I wonder whether one of the issues is it's not possible to translate without some sense of who your reader is, even if whether it's yourself or somebody else, whether it's a kind of vague collective or a particular person. And so one of the questions may just be who gets to decide who is the acceptable reader. Do you think, I mean, Gitanjali, can you imagine translating with no sense of who you're translating for?
I suppose you can't ever really pigeonhole the reader, and we've seen in so many of the reports on kind of the publishing industry, especially in the UK, the recent Spread the Word report, that the assumptions made on the UK readership is vastly off. And so when I think about who I translate for, I really relate to what Madhu Kaza talked about when she said that translation is the process of translation. She likens it to the process of migration or the movement of bodies. And so when we translate, we can't think about moving those words, that text, without its relationship with history, politics, race, imperialism. And so if we carry that metaphor on, we can think about translation, the translated text, as a diasporic community. And that comes with all the kind of pressures of assimilation, the processes of erasure, the threats of erasure, but also the potential for it to be a site of resistance for that community. And so if I think about who I translate for, I think I translate for the writer and the community that I'm representing, because I think that translation is all about dignity and respect for the person that you're translating, especially if that person and that community is marginalized in the country that you're translating from.
Thank you. I'll come back a little later to that parallel between diasporic text and diasporic people, groups of people. But one of the things I'm interested in, and Wei Ting, I suppose this is probably a question for you, is the status that English has in particular places, where English may be a language, it may be the language, it may be the majority language or a minority language. And one of the things that we don't take account of when we're talking about readers in this way is the fact that the relationship to English, if you're a heritage speaker, is different from necessarily from different kind of people from different kind of backgrounds and different kind of contexts. So Wei Ting, in Singapore, you have many languages. Your relationship to English is different from mine. It's different to Bitna, our common friend, who has a completely different relationship to English to the rest of us. And so I wonder if you can say something, Wei Ting, about that kind of, that limiting when we talk about who our reader is, to the sense that we're always talking about people who maybe are first language English readers, which is by no means everyone, always talking about heritage English readers, which is by no means everyone, I should say. No one, by no means everyone.
Singapore is an interesting case because in the 1980s, actually, we used to have bilingual education, and we used to have Chinese medium schools and English medium schools. And by the 1980s, it became an entirely English medium school system. And as a result, a lot of families found themselves losing their mother tongue, so to say. And in that sense, English was forced upon a large share of the population.
I wonder then, Wei Ting, going back to the question I asked Gitanjali about whether it's possible to translate without a reader in mind. I wonder whether that may be one of the things that is different between translating and writing, that in theory one can write without a reader, but translating kind of by its nature is aimed at, the etymology of the English word at least is about carrying across. It's sort of positional. It's about transferring something to a particular place, a particular reader, imaginary or otherwise. And I wonder if there's a kind of difference there.
Yeah, I call myself a bit of an accidental translator. And I think when I first started out writing and translating, I wasn't very conscious of who I was writing for. but it was along the process that it started to become more and more clear to me. And I call myself an accidental translator because the reason why I started translating was because when I was at this literary conference in Seoul, I just heard this story and I was so moved to tell this story to more people. And I started questioning why weren't more of such narratives available in the English language. And that set me down a rabbit hole, trying to discover why is it that certain works appear in English and this, what we actually see in the English language is such a tiny percentage of the literature that appears in the original language. It's in fact, a tiny fraction. And how does this selection process come about? And then that started me asking if it made me realize actually that I had a much more conscious, a much more important role than I realized in what gets translated, and that I think was what made me realize that who I really am translating for and it sounds a bit, sometimes it feels a bit self-important to say this, but I translate for people whose stories don't get heard in traditional English language publishing, whether because they don't have the voice or they don't have the access to the opportunities to be heard.
So that question of which stories whose stories get translated, which books get translated, what makes it in and what doesn't, is one of the things I wanted to talk about, because it's potentially one of the effects of a kind of assumed homogeneity of what a reader wants or what a reader finds palatable. Is what is going to be presented to them. There's an Alexander Chee line, just something like, books are not just the door to another world, they are part of the door to the whole world. And so there's a question of which of the bits of the picture are missing. And I wonder, Gitanjali, as an example, you and I both work with Brazil. And it feels to me that Brazil is a really good example of one of those places where certainly we don't translate very much, but what we translate is a very, very narrow selection of a certain kind of writer and a certain kind of story. It's not quite, as it would have been not that long ago, just carnival and football and street crime and samba. But nonetheless, there is a real kind of limiting of which stories are getting told from a country like Brazil.
Yeah, so just to name exactly whose story, it's usually white, middle class, able-bodied, straight writers from Rio and Sao Paulo in particular. And for a country that is so huge and with actually, I think 54% of the country identify as not white, it seems quite amazing that the majority of translated literature from Brazil is from that dominant kind of perspective. And so I think that it's interesting to think about, because when we think about translated literature from a specific place, we think about how the translated literature gives us access to that place and what it's about. And if we're only getting that narrow viewpoint, then it demonstrates how both the translator and I think this ties in with what Wei Ting just said, the translator in what text they select are complicit in perpetuating the same kind of social structures. So when we think about whose stories aren't getting told, we're thinking about how actually Black, Indigenous, and other minoritized identities in Brazil are often themes rather than authorial voices in literature. And often that comes with perpetuating really harmful stereotypes, which are then carried through into the Anglophone world through translation. And so I think that's a really kind of important thing to notice, that when we're thinking about bringing translated literature and whose voices and what actual stories are we creating about that place. And I think that actually when we think about the publishing industry here, and I think that this is why that Spread the Word report that I'll talk about again was so important, because it gave kind of evidence for what people have been experiencing, which is that publishers have been reported to think they think writers of color are commercially risky to publish. They think that stories that talk about, that have characters of color are niche and won't appeal to their core audience. And also that people of color don't read as much as their core audience, which is also really shocking. So I think I think we've got those two things to balance up, as in who the publishing industry and the pressures they put on what texts get translated, and also the translators themselves on which text that they choose to translate.
Thank you. Going back to that first bit Gitanjali was talking about, I'd be curious to know from Anton and from Somrita whether you have that same sense, whether there is, as it were, a particular kind of Korean book, a particular kind of Korean story or Bangla story or book that is just more likely to find its way into the global Anglophone publishing market. Anton, do you have a sense of, it's just easier to sell this kind of story rather than that kind of story?
There's so few works that get published from Korean, although it seems like a lot. And to be honest, we are overrepresented to the size of the country and whatnot. But
you're doing a lot better than Brazil, if that helps. That doesn't help.
That does kind of help. But there's so few that are published that I don't think it's really possible to really like draw a line to, like, K-thrillers were they were trying to make that a thing, but it's not, I don't think it's really so much a thing. There are a few books that sort of like fall into that category, but for me, it's always been, and as a reader, what I always want is, I don't want something that I know I will like. I want something that I didn't know I would like. And I think a lot of readers don't know what they're going to like until they're presented with it and until they read it. So with that in mind, I always, whenever I go out into a bookstore looking for something to translate, because I'm very mercenary that way, I go into a bookstore here in Seoul, and I look at what's out, and then I look at it and I go, and I try to, like, I really want to be surprised by this book. And then quite often I am. And then sometimes I'm surprised enough to be like, oh, I want to translate this book. Why? Because there's nothing like it. I did not expect this book to exist. Now that I know that it exists, and I really like it, I really like how they pulled it off, I want to translate it. So for me, it's always been, it hasn't been sort of like, what is the, that's what I think when I think of like, what is the audience gonna like? It's not so much that I have this like text where I want things to fit into it. It's more like, if I'm surprised by it and if I'm engaged by it, but I have to be surprised by it. And it has to like sort of like fall from the sky, because for me, that's always been what reading has been like for me. So it has to be that. It has to be something that I didn't know that I would like until I read it. So in that sense, that's what that readers respond to.
But then you're not kind of trying to second guess, well, this is quite an old book, it may be harder to sell, or this is a book by a Korean writer, but it's not set in Korea, it may be harder to sell. You're not trying to second guess that at that stage then? No,
because for me, that thing, that surprise, is the most important thing. And if it has that, then I don't care if the author said, Kang Kyung-hee is dead, I still translated her. It doesn't matter if the author is dead. It doesn't matter if it's an old book. It doesn't matter if it didn't do well in Korea, because it could do well in translation. Look at Hangang. I mean, she was more of a cult writer in Korea. She was not like the big deal that she is now. She became a hit overseas in translation, thanks to Deborah Smith. It's not like, so we don't know like where the next hit is going to come from, and no one knows. And whoever pretends they know are, just faking it. And so for me, it's always been like, that's the most important thing. And I am so confident in my abilities as a translator that I know that I could overcome all of those obstacles. But the one thing I cannot overcome is a text that is not surprising, that people expect to like or hate. That's the one thing that we just can't overcome as literary translators.
Somrita, what about you? Are you sort of mindful of what you think other people, be it publishers or might like, or are you more like Anton and you kind of think, actually, I'm going to have the confidence in my own taste and readers will find it?
So, Danny, I've been translating for 3 years now, and fortunately or unfortunately, I've never had to pitch a work to publishers. I've not done that yet. I look forward to doing that. So I've always worked on projects that have been commissioned, which means I tend to agree with what Gitanjali just said, that sometimes we're trying to pigeonhole writers and entire cultures. If you're trying to sell a book in translation from India to the UK or the US, it's more likely that the publisher is going to expect the book to talk about caste, talk about women's issues, talk about oppression of gender minorities or other minorities. So I do think we've become a bit of a type. And I've personally found it very difficult to sell a sci-fi written in Bangla, translated into English in the UK market. Or, for example, a book that I had worked on, it's sort of like this 5-volume, massive young adult adventure novel, Fire Songs. You know, there doesn't seem to be much of an interest in an adventure novel written in Bangla. You know, there is not, it seems that there is not much of a market in translation. So yeah, I do feel we're getting pigeonholed, and it's kind of sad, you know, because when we publish something from India or from Calcutta, from West Bengal, we represent this as minority writing, except that in Calcutta, in India, this is not minority writing at all. This could be an award-winning novel. And, you know, it caters to a large mass. It's massive. But then when it travels to the UK or the US in translation, because Bangla writing is so underrepresented in these two markets in particular, you know, it tends to get pigeonholed into that minority block. And so people have expectations of what they want to read of something that's coming from India.
That's a really interesting note about science fiction. I would totally read a science fiction work that was written in Bangla. When my debut short story, my debut literary translation was a science fiction work, and it was literally the second Korean science fiction short story published in English. And when I offered it to Words Without Borders, I didn't like, do you publish science fiction? Like, I mean, they do, but like, it just seemed like such a whatever. And now we have, like, next year, we're having like 3 books come out in Korean science fiction. So it's like, a lot of times I feel, a lot of times we felt like the Smoking Tigers, who happen to be the translators of these books, we felt like we're really fighting an uphill battle where it's like, we know that this is really awesome. We were helped by the fact that it was around 2016, 2017 when Liu Cixin's became such a huge hit. And so like, we were helped by that, I think. So the perception was like, oh, you know, science fiction and translation can be a thing. It's still something of an uphill battle, but it is definitely something that we have to fight for as translators. Like, if we want a queer work to be published, if we want a science fiction work to be published, we are kind of like working against that perception of, you know, oh, it's literary translation is very literary. It can't be genre. It can't use all of these different elements of like thrillers and so on. Although, you know, I mean, the Girl Who series from, are they Swedish or Norwegian? Sorry, I've never read them. They're very popular. So despite there are some translated works that are very popular in genre, but like they're still quite rare, and it's still an uphill battle.
I completely agree with you, Anton, and I'm like really glad that you mentioned Words Without Borders, because I think there are journals that are really making the market a lot more democratic. So shout out to people, to platforms like Words Without Borders or Asymptote. There are really a lot more, you know, indie publishers that are risking or are willing to invest in genre fiction or in works that don't sort of fit into these stereotypes. And of course, now, as you said, Anton, we need to fight for it. As I said, I've not pitched anything before, but if I were to pitch like you, I would pitch something that I want to read. I wouldn't, you know, just pitch something which everybody else wants to read, sitting in like an Anglophone world. So, and yeah, with the internet, of course, it's a lot more democratic now with digital platforms. We can also just put things up on our blogs or websites and sort of figure out if this mythical reader has any interest or not in the work, instead of like, you know, having these big publishers sitting as gatekeepers and dictating, yes, this is permissible, and no, that is not marketable at all.
I think there's also the question, isn't there, about, I mean, Anton talked about, you know, it's somehow having to be literary. And I think one of the problems is not just that it's also that translated literature often is seen as not just having a literary function, but having a kind of almost an anthropological function. And so the purpose is to find out about this culture. And really, why would I read a Bangla novel which is set on Mars if I can read a novel written in English which is set on Mars? If I'm going to read a Bangla novel, it has to tell me something somehow about this culture which I don't know anything about, rather than, as Gitanjali was saying earlier, actually thinking about the author and the authorial voice and all of those things that are involved in a piece of great writing, which are not just to do with presenting an exotic culture to people for whom it is unfamiliar. I wanted to ask something about, having talked a little bit about, I suppose, what the restrictions are on what gets translated and what doesn't. I wanted to go back to the thing that Anton said at the beginning about the sort of awkwardness, or what was identified as awkwardness, and whether there is a risk, Wei Ting, maybe I'll ask you this first, of translated text somehow being expected to be more flat, to be flattened somehow, whether the expectation for something which is translated compared to something that is written in English is much less bold stylistically, because there is an assumption that it's going to be flattened out.
That is an interesting question, because there seems to be, so if you just look at like informal anecdotal evidence from the US or the UK, there's been a lot of chatter about why so little translated fiction gets published. But there seems to be a psychological barrier in those audiences towards reading translated fiction, because they think, oh, I have to overcome something in order to be able to, you know, enjoy this text, when really with a translated work that should not be the case. Either that, or you should have an open enough mind to know that you cannot expect to identify with everything that you read in the text. But on the part of the translator, when you ask about, I mean, I don't think that any translator sets out to flatten the text. But my own experience, so one thing I do like to do is I like to compare, you know, the translated works with the original. And I think, you know, recently there was a bit of a debate about Kawakami's Breast and Eggs, about different translations and whether, and how the dialect, there was a lot of discussion about how the dialect gets translated. And I mean, my own observations is that I did find that a lot of the, not just in her work, but in other Japanese texts as well, you know, I find that a lot of the very lyrical moments of description, when it gets translated into English, it becomes something. I mean, I wouldn't say that it isn't an authentic translation. I think that every translator has to, I give them the leeway to translate it the way that they want to. But then the question is, what are we aiming to do with translation? Are we aiming to replicate? Should we aim to replicate that lyricism? What is the important point? But if you want to try and replicate, for example, every single part of that beautiful phrase of description, you might end up missing the forest for the trees. I became less judgmental, I would say, when I started translating myself. And I started thinking, oh my God, this is such a beautiful piece of Japanese description, but how am I going to render it into English? And I think that was a point for me when I realized that I can't translate it word for word. If I want to, I have to come up with something completely new that has the essence, but may not use the same words. So I think that we shouldn't think of these as flaws in translation, but something that I've been thinking about recently is translation is a departure point for the translator to create something new, and we should be open to that, both as readers and as translators. and also as writers.
There's that line, which I'm sure many of you will have heard, our friend Jeremy Chiang, who says, I keep being told by editors, English doesn't do that. And my response is, well, English hasn't done that yet. And I'm interested in the extent to which translators are allowed to be the people who are doing the kind of stylistically interesting things that stretch a language, rather than having to be more kind of polite and cautious, because somehow the benefit of the doubt is given less to the strangeness of translation. English is, this great, malleable language, which is open to novelty and influence and that kind of thing. But there's this risk, I think, that English gets stretched by the innovative stylists who write in English, and translators have to somehow be much more normative and much more conforming. And I was thinking, Gitanjali, about the thing you were talking about earlier with the sort of diaspora parallel. There was a piece you and Jesse wrote for Words Without Borders about good translations, and you talk about good being not just to do with ideas of quality, but also to do with virtue and to do with obedience. And it made me think about this sort of good immigrant thing, where the text has to be quite grateful to be here, frankly, and it has to keep its head down, and it has to not bother anyone, and it will be tolerated. I don't know whether that feels like a kind of wildly, going too far sort of parallel, but it feels to me that this kind of tolerance for the extent to which we're prepared to tolerate translations being interesting, being stylistically bold. Does that seem like a, so you can't tell who I'm looking at. Gitanjali, I'm looking at you at this moment. Zoom is.
I really relate to that. I think that sometimes the attitude towards translated works in English is just another way of kind of exerting control over something that can't be controlled. Like perpetuating the idea that language is something that we can control, which has like massively imperial overtones. So I think that when we think about translation, it's like this unique opportunity to push the boundaries of English. And I suppose, what Somrita was talking about, showing what English can do at the point of contact with other languages. There's so many things that we have to push English to do in order to have the translation work, essentially. And I think that's what the unique thing about translation is that there's so many different ways in which a translation could be considered good, which is what makes it this unique art form. And I suppose like when I hear that question, I have to think about it from my own perspective as a minoritized translator, and how the pressures to conform are even greater, because there's always going to be a question of how her name is that, how good is her English really, how well is she going to be able to write the translation, is her prose going to be really fluent, and the assessment of a good translation in the UK publishing industry, and I think also the US, is there's this emphasis on fluency and sort of seamless prose, not awkward, as Anton said. But also what's funny is that when you are a minoritized translator, the idea that your fluency is in question before your prose is even seen. The amount of translators who have said that, different editors have said, oh, it's too awkward here, and then another editor will look at the same piece and say you're too fluent, as if that's a thing. So yeah.
Well, this is a question also about the fact that, Somrita, I'm going to ask you, I suppose, about the different Englishes that we all have, and what those kind of hierarchies are, not just individual to individual, but as though there were a kind of, single, solid, hermetic Indian English, British English, whatever English, whatever English. And we're obviously kidding ourselves if we think that these hierarchies of different Englishes are not incredibly entrenched as these sort of discrete things. And I wonder, Somrita, if you could say something about that in your experience of that, of kind of jostling against that hierarchy.
You know, Danny, I'd read a few days ago, perhaps in an article, that Gertrude Stein said she went to Paris so she could be alone with the English language. And I don't think it's quite possible to be alone with a language. A language doesn't exist alone. It doesn't exist in vacuum. I mean, I could try to be alone with English or alone with Bangla, but it just won't work, because languages, like love, cannot be confined to communities or watertight compartments. They spill over, they're messy. My English has completely messed up my Bangla. And similarly, my Bangla also colors my English, infects my English. You know, this infection, so, you know, what I'm saying is that this is not a problem when I'm publishing in India, because this is how Indians speak. However, if I'm trying to publish this work in the UK or the US, my English register might seem a little different to some people. And, you know, it is this idea of difference, this idea of diseased English. I think Johannes Johansson had said, I mean, he called this the sickness in translation, right? So, you know, I guess this brings us to the question of who is this mythical English reader, and how insular is she or her publisher or her editor, that she's not aware of the fact that this is 2020 and we speak different Englishes around the world. And why is she unable to acknowledge or make room for these different Englishes? You know, as a translator or as a writer, when I'm sending a work to the UK or to the US, I'm very self-conscious, and I try to sort of strike a balance between how much of my Indianness in English should I retain in that work, for that work to be palatable, for that work to be digestible by this sort of mythical English reader, so that her reading experience is not slowed down. I mean, frankly speaking, I don't think slow reading is as bad as the kind of reputation it's gathered over time. And usually my editors and I have been able to arrive at a meeting point where we say a little bit of indigestion is okay. But you know, to sort of directly answer what you were asking me, Danny. So English was introduced in India in 1835. And when it was introduced as a medium of instruction, our native languages were seen as worthless, and that we were not producing anything worth reading or writing or pursuing or studying in any of our Indian native languages. But now, 200 years down the line, some of us have claimed this language for ourselves, and we don't let this language own us anymore. So for some of us, English is no longer that foreign language. It's become our first language. It's the language of my emotional makeup. So all the quirks and kinks that you find in my language, they are my own. And I'm reading, thinking, writing, speaking. I'm doing everything in English. I'm dreaming in English, if it comes to that. So it's so as opposed to English being like my language of intellectual makeup, where I'm always aware of what I'm doing, always aware of this hierarchy. Usually when I'm writing, usually when I'm translating, I tend to ramble a bit, and that's the kind of, you know, that's the kind of language I speak here. That's the kind of language, that's the kind of lives we lead here, you know. So I guess I'm trying to say that I don't homogenize my translations consciously. I sort of wait for inputs from my editor to tell me how much of it is okay and how much of my quirks and kinks I have to sort of sacrifice at the altar of this monolithic concept of English. But I mean, we can't deny this. This exists, and you know, Anglophone publishing circles do hierarchize, you know, and we've got sort of correct English registers and incorrect or dirty or diseased English registers. I guess I'm just trying to say that diseased is not necessarily bad. You need to give it a chance. And then, as Gitanjali said, we've been talking about this at the BCLT summer school this year as well, Danny, that, you know, if you keep thinking about what that one monolithic English register is supposed to do, then you'll never end up figuring out what it can do. So I let my English ramble a bit, like my thoughts. I let it sort of take a stroll and sometimes get lost in sort of neighboring language fields and then come out the way it does, you know.
I think you used the word diseased, but also you had so many different and differently loaded ways of expressing. You said English has messed up my Bangla and Bangla has colored my English, and those are completely different ways of thinking about the value of those relationships also. I wanted to talk a little bit before we end about when we're talking about this question of I guess who decides and who decides that something is acceptable, who decides that a story is legitimate or a voice is legitimate. It seems to me that the who is a really important question that we haven't talked about very much. Gitanjali referred to the Spread the Word report. There's a Claudia Rankine line, which is whiteness wants the kind of progress that reflects what it values, that reflects itself, or that is a reflection of itself. And to some extent, everyone's going to have their own measures. So possibly the question is not just how we change that, not, as it were, making me as a white man in England think differently, but think about who are going to be the people who are the translators, who are going to be the people who are the editors, who are going to be the people who are the decision makers who will impose whatever metric of value is important to them. Is that, Gitanjali, is one of the things we're talking about not just a different way of needing a different way of seeing, but needing a different personnel, essentially?
I think what would be helpful to start with is by not thinking of the mythical English reader as a person or a community, but as a system or a structure that shapes the way that the industry runs, that shapes our self-image, that essentially works to support dominant structures. And that those dominant structures, I mean, it's essentially, if we replace like who is the mythical English reader with coloniality, I think that we would get some answers. I think that, what I don't want this to end up being is thinking about like, oh, we just need more diversity in the industry, because more Black and brown faces in the industry isn't going to do anything for equity, for inclusion. So we really need to think about like how those structures are implemented before we start thinking about dismantling them. So yeah, I think thinking about individual people is not useful until we think about the structures.
But as individuals, maybe not individuals as a target, as it were, but for us as individuals, there is a question about what we can do in terms of how we relate to these structures and what we challenge and what we accede to. I mean, I wonder, Anton, whether you have a feeling about what you feel I guess empowered to do. I mean, I don't think there's likely to be much disagreement in this group of five of us that what some of the problems are that need solving, need changing. But you have a sense, Anton, of as one person, as a group of people and your friends and fellow translators, and however big this community is, of there being something that you can do about it on any scale?
What I do in my practice is I try to project a kind of Nietzschean Übermensch kind of charisma in that, yeah, I'm a translator. I'm a big deal. I know what I'm talking about. And I say it with so much aplomb and confidence and, you know, fake it till you make itness that at some point people kind of like started believing that I actually know what I'm talking about. And I do, but, you know, there's a lot of projection and a lot of effort that I have to do. And the thing, and because I realize that translators kind of need to be seen as an authority on language and an authority on literature and an authority on translation, because quite often, until quite recently, like there were no celebrity translators. There were no translators who there were like readers did not buy books just because they like the translator. I mean, they exist now, not a lot, but they do exist now. So this is a recent phenomenon. And that's because we are beginning to get some authority on our own. Like, for example, I feel like the hashtag Name the Translator movement is kind of like trying to make a kind of a social space for translators in order to have that authority so that people will read the works that we do without this kind of like ecological perspective, that they'll respect it as an artistic work, that they will and they'll trust us as a literary authority. And this is a new development, and partly because I feel like things like Twitter and like social media, it helps us to project and to get our work out there, to get our thoughts out there, and people begin to see us and they're like, oh, like what they're saying is actually very interesting, and I want to read their work. So I feel like we have to kind of like lean into the kind of Nietzschean celebrity kind of like energy, which is terrible because we're basically perpetuating the previous gatekeeping system just, you know, for our benefit. But for now, that's kind of like what I'm doing. And God, I'm gonna get a lot of comments about this, aren't I? So I'm gonna stop.
Well, friends, we're fine. What about the rest of you? Does anyone else have a feeling about that? About the things that individually or as a community we can think about quite actively to challenge this. It's as Gitanjali said, of course, we're talking about structures rather than individuals, but the individual is useful.
Anton shared something yesterday from that Turkish writer, and then I like that quote. She said, "Writing is an act of survival." So I think writing is an act of survival, and translation is an act of resistance.
The line is from Aslı Erdoğan, I think.
Yes.
Yeah, that's very good. I do almost always at the end of sharing events say, that was so interesting, we could have gone on for many hours. I am often lying when I say that. I'm not lying when I say that now.
We're just getting started.
I know there is a lot we could have done, but we can maybe get people to pay like a premium thing for the second hour.
We need to get like drinks after this.
We will have virtual drinks somewhere. I'm sorry we're not in the same place. It's lovely to see you all. Anton has something to drink. There we are. I'm very grateful to Wei Ting, to Gitanjali, to Somrita, and to Anton for this brilliant conversation. I am sure those of you who are listening will be continuing the conversation on Twitter. We're going to have to stop now because it's time to announce the selected emerging translators for the 2020-2021 Emerging Translators Mentorship. For now, thank you all very much. I hope you enjoyed that panel. We're now, as you've gathered, going to announce the this year's Emerging Translator Mentorship mentees. I just wanted to say something very briefly about the program for those of you who don't know anything about it. The Emerging Translators Mentoring Program has been running for 10 years now. We've just reached our 10th anniversary. The program has now worked in 29 languages. With this new cohort we're announcing today, we reach tantalizingly 98 translators who will have worked on it. We haven't quite hit our century, but very nearly hit our century. And it's a really exciting time reaching our 10th anniversary and looking back over the amazing work that's gone into this program since we started in 2010, how many brilliant translators have been through the program, and how many of them not only have made careers as translators, but who have contributed in really interesting and various ways to the translation profession. So we're going to see now the chosen mentees for the 2020-2021 cohort of the Emerging Translator Mentorship. Right, so first of all, we have, which one is first? Danish. The Danish mentorship this year is going to Sharon Rhodes, who is going to be mentored by Paul Russell Garrett, who was in the program himself many, many years ago, sponsored in this case by our friends at the Danish Arts Foundation. Next is Italian. Our mentor Howard Curtis is going to be working with Georgia Wall this year. That one is sponsored generously by the Istituto Italiano di Cultura. Third is Japanese. This year, it's in partnership with the Havelseka Young Translators Prize, who've chosen to work with Japanese this year. The Havelseka Young Translator Prize had a record number of entries this year, with over 100 translations of Yusho Takiguchi's Yakyoku that have come in from all over the world for this prize. The judges, Polly Barton, David Karashima, Rowan Hisayu Buchanan, Monique Paris-Jackson, and Michaela Pedlow, were unanimous in choosing their winner this year. It's Jessie Kirkwood, who's going to be mentored by Polly Barton. The prize, the Havelseka Young Translator Prize, includes a place on this mentorship program, and it's a program that's supported this year by the Tadashi and I Initiative for Globalizing Japanese Humanities at UCLA and Waseda University. Next up is Korean mentorship that is sponsored, as always, by our friends at LTI Korea, the Literature Translation Institute of Korea. This year, Anton Hur, whom you've just seen on the panel, is going to be mentoring Claire Richards. Next up is Norwegian. The Royal Norwegian Embassy and Norla are generously supporting us again. We're very grateful to them for their support. Alice Fletcher is going to be the mentee this year, working with mentor Carrie Dixon. Next is Polish. We have a Polish mentorship with Antonia Lloyd-Jones, supported by the Polish Cultural Institute of London. Konrad Zielinski is going to be our Polish translator working with Antonia this year. Russian this year, supported by the Institut Pedagoga. Robert Chandler is going to be mentoring, and Ruben Woolley has been chosen as our Russian translation mentee. Swiss French, working with Pro Helvetia again this year. Sarah Ardizone is our mentor, and Rosie Eyre has been chosen to work with Sarah this year. And finally, our 9th mentee of this year, part of the NCW Visible Communities program, Anam Safar, who translates from Arabic, is going to be working with Amina Kandasamy for the 9th mentorship of our program. So those are our 9 mentorships for this year. We're excited to have all of them with us, to be working with all of them. I just wanted to, before we finish, mention a few events that are going to be coming up in the next couple of days. As many of you will know, it's International Translation Day, and so there is an awful lot going on, including another event in the Meet the World series, of which tonight's panel was a part, which is coming up shortly. For those of you who know it's International Translation Day tomorrow if you are watching this live, which is to say if today is September 29th for you. If that is the case and you're watching this live, English Pen is running an International Translation Day all-day program tomorrow. There is still a little bit of time for you to buy tickets, by which I mean about half an hour. So that is to say until 8:30 p.m. Today's 29th September 2020. If you haven't yet had a chance to get your tickets for the English Pen International Translation Day program, you can just about do that if you go relatively quickly. couple of other events to flag up. Not only is tomorrow International Translation Day, but it's also the last day of World Kid Lit Month. And there are a couple of translating children's books events coming up in the next 2 or 3 days. If you go to the World Kid Lit blog and the events page, you'll see those things that are advertised on that page that may be of interest to you. And finally, I'm sure many of you know ALTA, the American Literary Translators Association, have their annual conference. It started today, in fact, running through until October the 18th. This year, for obvious reasons, the conference is going to be all online, which means it is much more accessible to some of us, which is a very nice silver lining to those of us who can't get to Tucson, Arizona this year. So do have a look at the ALTA program. There's some amazing things in the next 2.5 weeks, and consider registering for that or attending some events. One in particular, I'll just mention, ALTA have a kind of sister mentoring program to ours, and there is going to be a reading this Thursday, 1st of October, at, I think it's at 2 p.m. Eastern time, of their cohort of emerging translator mentees. So do tune in for that if you possibly can. That's it. Just a few very quick thank yous before we go. First of all, of course, for the mentoring program, congratulations to the mentees. Thank you to our very generous mentors and our sponsors. To the whole team at NCW who run the program so wonderfully for us, especially, I should say, those of you who know that this program well will know that the especially is very obvious, especially to Sarah Bauer, of course, who's been running this program for most of the last 10 years and who this program is hers more than anyone's, and its success is entirely down to her. So thank you to Sarah and the rest of the team. NCW, National Centre for Writing, I should say, because they're increasing their translation work, you may also be interested to know that the new translation section on their website just went live, I think, today. So have a look at that, sign up for their mailing list. Thank you to them at NCW for programming today's event. Thank you to Martin for making it possible for you to see and hear us all. Thank you to all the speakers on our panel one last time. I hope you enjoyed that panel. I think the beginning of a very long and interesting conversation. Wei Ting, Somrita Urni Ganguly, Anton Hur and Gitanjali Patel. I hope you have a very good International Translation Day tomorrow, and thank you all very much for watching. Good night.